Good morning. This is Dr. Mike, and I want to welcome you to our last, from my perspectives, for this course. We're entering week 8, and of course, this is exam week. It's also the week that we kind of look at the Civil War in a very brief format. You realize that the Civil War encompasses books and books, and we could spend years studying this subject. But I do want you to just kind of whet your appetite a bit, maybe. More people are interested in the Civil War than I am, and that's not my favorite subject of American history. As I've told you, as you go through history, one of the great ways to learn history is to find some little postage stamp that you're interested in and research that and work on that, and then you'll find that you kind of work off of that in a lot of other areas. And before you know it, you'll have a lot of interest, but not everything in American history will prove to be exciting and something that you enjoy. And I had one professor who loved trains. He's written over 30 books on trains in the United States. Others are into the Civil War, the battles. Some people focus on the battles. Some people focus on the leaders. Some people focus on the things that entice them. I guess if I do any work in the Civil War for myself, it's in religious studies, because I'm very interested in the fact that the United States was in the middle of one of the biggest religious revivals in its history, in the Second Great Awakening. And the Civil War happens right in the middle of it. The questions around that are why religion did not make much of a difference, and why so many times religion was more the problem than it was the solution. Because you had preachers on both sides, in the North and the South, who were pro-slavery and anti-slavery. You had churches on both sides, and yet they all seemed to not have that big of an effect. And so there's a huge theological crisis that comes out of the Civil War. And God was on both sides. The men would go out every day and fight and kill each other and come back into camp at night, clean up, eat dinner, and have a religious service, get right with God, and go out and do it again. So the big question there is, why did religion not make a bigger difference then and after the Civil War, in the age of Jim Crow and other things in the South? So that's my interest. If I'm going to study Civil War, it's along those lines. So I'm sure many of you that have more interest in it than maybe I do. So you find some things that will be helpful. We've talked about the fact that the Constitutional Convention, in order not to deal with slavery, it was such a contentious issue in 1787 that they kicked the can forward for 20 or 30 years and thought the future generations could do a better job of dealing with that. I think that was a mistake, personally. I don't think that it got better, it got worse. There was more money involved 20, 30 years later than there was in 1787. Much more people involved with plantations and the buildings. And then you had the Western encroachment as people moved west. Many of the plantation owners, because of the soil situation, growing cotton and not replenishing the soil, wanted to move west, open plantations, and of course have their slaves to work the cotton, because it was an extremely labor-intensive operation. Is going to make that issue a lot greater. So it becomes very contentious after 1820, from there up until the countdown of the war in 1860. And so basically the Compromise of 1850 was very important, because they agreed that if one state could come in as a slave state, and equally another state could come in as a free state. And so the one-on-one comparison would work up until the Kansas-Nebraska Compromise, which negated the 1850 Compromise, which pretty well said we're going to war. That's what the Kansas-Nebraska Compromise did. It pushed us into war. There was no more compromise with slavery. And so that was the issue. People want to argue over the causes of the Civil War. There were several. It wasn't just one. It wasn't just slavery, even though that's a major contender. It was also over states' rights and other things that people want to argue about. Those feelings continued after the Civil War is over in what I call the religion of the lost cause. And I call it a religion because it's exactly what I think it was. People they got caught up in the historical moment, and they got their feelings hurt, and they got defeated in battle. And so, I kind of grew up even in the 1960s, the South still had that chip on their shoulders. Had not been anything written much about the South's perspective for 100 years, because they were too busy licking their wounds and setting up, statues to Confederate soldiers and laying wreaths and having religious services there almost as though they're worshiping the past. And so they didn't get very far along. We've talked before about the statement that Winston Churchill is described as making, that winners write history. And that's exactly, the Civil War is my favorite example of that being proved, because the North wrote most of the history books for the next 100 years and had most of the publishing houses. And so there was very little in the way of a Southern perspective or a slave perspective. In fact, we don't get a slave perspective at all, except for during the Great Depression of the 1930s and 40s, when the United States government sent out these people to find former slaves that were still living and to interview and record their statements. And of course, you're talking about 70 years past the fact. And while they were primary documents, their comments were, they were children when that happened. So their memory would have been limited at best. So basically, we didn't get a slave perspective. It died with them. For the very few who could write and left us something, that makes it all the more worthwhile, even though it does limit the perspective. So from 1820 forward, we're going to have this countdown as we move west, as the West begins to eat up more and more of our time and attention, especially Texas and Mexico as we get into the 1840s. James K. Polk, who is the follower of Andrew Jackson, does a land grab when he takes Texas and California. He will eventually add Washington State and Oregon to it, what is now those states. And so basically the largest land acquisition after the Louisiana Purchase with Thomas Jefferson is going to be the Texas acquisition. And then there's going to be a huge movement west, pushing the Native Americans. Remember, we pushed them over the river, over Mississippi River after the Trail of Tears. In 1828, they side with the South in the Civil War, and the South loses. They're declared in violation of treaty. So the federal government can now take anything they want. And so they pretty much will, in the next 20 or 40 years up through 1889, which is the Battle of Wounded Knee, they will continue to take native lands and force them onto reservations, so that by 1889, it's pretty well over for Native American resistance. And they get, it's not a pretty picture anyways, as those of you in the Native American class have seen. It's not a pretty picture from there even up until the 1960s. But this is what virtually happens. So basically the Civil War starts. There are some really major battles. I think it's interesting to note that there was some discussion that Great Britain would come in on the side of the South because of the old Southern aristocracy, and their way of life kind of coincided with Britain's, except the one fact was that it was about money, because the British were getting most of their cotton from the South, as was the North. So the northern cotton mills depended on Southern cotton, slave-made cotton. So you can see that there was not a very big high ground there morally over slavery, as long as you're making money at work. So, but basically they were waiting for a big enough battle to announce. Surprisingly, in addition to that, Abraham Lincoln is waiting for a major Northern victory to announce his Emancipation Proclamation. That's another story that's of great interest. You might want to study sometimes, but the Emancipation Proclamation, I don't think was as much about Abraham Lincoln and his desire to free slaves as it was to hope that if he freed the slaves behind enemy lines, which is what the Emancipation did not do anything for slaves in the West or in the North, but behind enemy lines, that he hoped that they would rise up against their masters and throw off the yoke and help the Union win the war. Up until Gettysburg, the North did not do so well. The South had all the great generals. In fact, when South Carolina seceded from the Union in December of 1869, many of the teachers at West Point and Annapolis and some of the other area military schools resigned their commissions and came back south. Robert E. Lee was one of those to take over the fighting for the Army. So you see that, and they didn't have many in the North. They always struggled with generals. In fact, as you know, with Ulysses S. Grant, who had a major drinking problem, he became their successful one. But they went through several generals trying to get them to pursue the South and defeat the enemy, and many of them were kind of battle shy. So basically, the war is going to be fought in major battles. And so the Emancipation Proclamation was delayed because Lincoln also had to be careful of his political position for reelection, because, as I said, not everybody in the North was pro freedom for the slaves, and so you had to. He walked a tightrope for most of his administration. If you ever want to read really a good book, one is called The Leadership. One's called The A Team of Rivals. Kern's book on Abraham Lincoln surrounding himself with his enemies in the election of 1859. Each one of them became a cabinet officer, so that he was sure he was getting not just yes men, but men that would give him the straight up on most issues, so that he could make a good decision, which has been a model book, model idea, if you will, for generations. And so, you know, I think you ought to read those books on leadership. Her book on leadership and her book on The Team of Rivals are two of the best that I could recommend to you. But reading is fundamental to understanding history and getting a better perspective. So anyways, Gettysburg happened, Emancipation Proclamation happened. Britain did not declare, that did not happen. And so from that point forward, it is a major countdown to the South being finally defeated. And then Sherman, who does something that has made him the trope of history, he comes south and burns Atlanta and South Carolina, Columbia, basically just in vindictiveness and to punish. It wasn't about restoring the Union at that point, it was about punishing the offenders. And so he did a fairly thorough job of that, but it also so inflamed the South with hatred that it would be a century before that would ever be appeased or changed. And you still find lots of animosity in the South against the North. They never forget these things. And so basically, that explains a lot of our current history. So after the war, of course, Lincoln is assassinated almost immediately. Andrew Johnson, who's an interesting dude from Tennessee, the vice president, puts everybody in the South under martial law except his home state of Tennessee. And they began Reconstruction, which is going to go up until 1877, when Rutherford B. Hayes is voted and not elected. And we have, as we've said, several of those events in our history. It's not unusual for a vote to be contested. But there was a deal struck with the South that if they would vote to confirm Rutherford B. Hayes as the president and prevent a constitutional crisis, that they would end Reconstruction. And so the day they agreed, the federal troops were sent to their barracks and they were sent home immediately after that. Now imagine they go home, leaving behind the former slaves in the hands of their former owners. A South that is devastated and burned to the ground. No banks. They required $50,000 in cash to open a bank in the South. There was very little food, starvation, and so they fall into sharecropping, and so it's just another form of slavery. You work for the man who owns the plantation, you buy your food at his store, you live in the house he gives you, and whatever's left over, the pittance, is yours to keep. So basically, we end up trading one form of slavery for another in the South, and then we go into the cotton mill industry, which I contend to be the third form of slavery, because it's the same dynamic. Working for the owner, he might be living in a better house, but you're paying him a quarter a week to live there. You're buying from his store. He sometimes doesn't even pay you in cash. He pays you in chips, and you just change your chips for whatever you need at the company store. So that model just kind of reinvents itself through the South. So anyways, as you read this material this week, I hope that you will take some time to digest and to think about this great period of American history, and maybe find some things that you can tap into that will increase your love for history. This is our last meeting, and I do hope that this class has maybe not made you love history, but change your opinion to not hate it. Or maybe it's made you love it. Maybe you want to take some more classes, and I encourage you to do that. And I look forward to seeing you in some of those. Thank you.